Every tomato gardener has had that moment. You walk out to your garden, coffee in hand, and something is just wrong. The leaves are curling. The fruit is small and spotted. The plants look tired, almost defeated, and you cannot figure out why. You watered, you fertilized. You did everything the way you always do. But your tomatoes are struggling and your neighbors are not. Here is what nobody told you. The problem might not be what you are doing to your tomatoes. It might be what you planted next to them. Companion planting mistakes are quietly destroying tomato harvests all over the world, and most gardeners never connect the dots. By the time you finish this video, you will know exactly which plants are sabotaging your tomatoes, the science behind why it happens, and what to do about it before the damage becomes permanent. Tomatoes are one of the most rewarding crops you can grow, but they are also one of the most sensitive when it comes to their neighbors. Unlike some vegetables that tolerate crowded, mixed planting with very little drama, tomatoes respond intensely to what surrounds them. The wrong neighbor can trigger disease outbreaks, invite pest explosions, starve your plants of nutrients, or chemically interfere with their root development in ways you cannot see until the damage is already done. What makes this especially frustrating is that the effects are rarely immediate. You plant in spring, everything looks fine through early summer, and then by the time the problems show up, you have already lost weeks of the growing season. You cannot reverse poor companion choices mid-season without uprooting plants and disrupting your whole garden layout. This is why understanding these relationships before you plant is so critical. The science behind plant compatibility comes down to 4 main factors. Resource competition, which is the battle for water, nutrients, and light. Allelopathy, which is the ability of some plants to release chemical compounds that suppress or harm neighboring plants. Shared pest and disease pressure, where certain plant pairings essentially create a pest buffet that attracts and concentrates damage. And microclimate disruption, where the physical presence of one plant alters the growing conditions for another through shade, airflow restriction, or soil moisture changes. Keep those 4 categories in mind as we go through each plant on this list, because understanding the mechanism is what turns this from a list of rules into genuine gardening knowledge you can apply for the rest of your life. The first plant on this list might surprise you because it is something almost every vegetable gardener grows, and it feels like it should be a natural companion to tomatoes. Potatoes. They come from the same botanical family, they thrive in similar climates, and they are both staples in most kitchen gardens. The instinct to grow them side by side makes complete sense, which is exactly why this mistake is so common and so costly. The problem begins with disease. Both tomatoes and potatoes are members of the Solanaceae family, and they share a long list of pathogens. The most dangerous of these is Phytophthora infestans, the organism responsible for late blight. This is not a minor fungal issue you can spray away. Late blight is the same disease that caused the Irish potato famine in the 1840s. It spreads through the air via spores, moves rapidly in cool and humid conditions, and can destroy an entire planting in a matter of days once it gets established. When you grow tomatoes and potatoes side by side, you are essentially creating a disease highway. If late blight infects one crop, it has immediate access to the other. The spores do not have to travel far. They are already there, sitting in the air between 2 fully susceptible hosts. Many gardeners who have experienced a late blight outbreak describe it as watching their plants collapse almost overnight. Green and lush one day, brown, rotting, and completely unsalvageable within a week. Beyond disease, there is the nutrient competition to consider. Potatoes are classified as heavy feeders, meaning they extract large quantities of nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and calcium from the soil to support their underground tuber development. Tomatoes are equally demanding for similar reasons, since they are channeling enormous energy into fruit production. When these 2 crops share root space, neither one gets what it needs. The result is fruit that is undersized, nutrient deficient, and often prone to disorders like blossom end rot in tomatoes, which is directly linked to calcium uptake interference. There is also the question of pest overlap. Colorado potato beetles are one of the most destructive pests in the home vegetable garden, and while they prefer potatoes, they will absolutely move onto tomatoes when populations get large or when the potato crop starts to decline. Planting these 2 crops in proximity essentially doubles your exposure risk. The fix is straightforward but requires planning. Keep potatoes and tomatoes on opposite ends of your garden, separated by as much distance as your space allows. In smaller gardens, do not plant both crops in the same season if you cannot guarantee at least 30 feet of separation. And critically, practice 3 to 4 year crop rotation with both plants. Never plant either one in a bed where the other grew the previous season, because the soil can harbour blight spores and nematode populations that survived the winter. If this is helping you, hit the like button right now and share this with a fellow gardener who needs it. Drop a comment below telling me which of these mistakes you have been making. I read every single one. And if you are not subscribed yet, do it now so you never miss what is coming next. Back to it. Now let us talk about fennel, and this one is fascinating from a plant science perspective. Fennel is a beautiful aromatic herb that most gardeners either love intensely or never think about. It has that distinctive anise fragrance, feathery foliage, and it attracts beneficial insects like swallowtail butterflies and parasitic wasps. On the surface, it sounds like a gardener's ally. But fennel has a dark side that makes it one of the most broadly incompatible plants in the entire garden, not just with tomatoes, but with almost everything. Fennel practices what scientists call allelopathy, which is the production and release of chemical compounds into the surrounding soil that inhibit the germination and growth of other plants. This is a survival strategy. Fennel suppresses its competition by essentially poisoning the root zone. The primary compounds responsible are polyphenols and volatile oils that leach from the roots, decomposing leaves, and even rain-washed residue from the foliage. For tomatoes specifically, these allelopathic compounds interfere with root development and nutrient uptake. The effect is not dramatic and sudden the way late blight is. Instead, it is slow and insidious. Your tomato plants will look slightly off. They will grow more slowly than expected. They will produce fewer blossoms. The fruit will be smaller, and when you test your soil and find nothing wrong, and you adjust your watering and find no improvement, and you add fertilizer and still nothing changes, you may never realize it was the fennel 3 feet away causing all of it. Research in plant allelopathy has shown that fennel root exudates can reduce germination rates in nearby plants by 30 to 70%, depending on concentration and proximity. That is not a minor effect. That is a fundamental disruption of your plant's ability to establish and thrive. The solution is to grow fennel in complete isolation. If you want it in your garden for culinary purposes, plant it in its own container, away from vegetable beds entirely. Fennel actually does not mind container growing. It will still produce abundantly as long as the container is deep enough to accommodate its taproot, at least 12 to 14 inches. By containerizing fennel, you protect everything else in your garden while still enjoying the herb. One more thing worth knowing about fennel. Even after you remove it, the allelopathic compounds it deposited in the soil can persist for a season. If you have been growing fennel in a bed and you want to transition it to tomatoes, amend heavily with compost, allow a full off-season, and consider a cover crop of something like crimson clover or winter rye before planting tomatoes in that space. Moving on to corn. The tomato and corn pairing is extremely common among first-time gardeners who have read a bit about companion planting and like the idea of the Three Sisters system, which traditionally pairs corn with beans and squash. The assumption is that tall plants create beneficial microclimates and that mixing crops disrupts pests. Sometimes that is true. With corn and tomatoes, together it is spectacularly false. The connecting villain here is the Helicoverpa zea moth, whose larvae are known as the tomato fruitworm and the corn earworm depending on which crop they are attacking. It is the same insect. These moths are powerful flyers that seek out their host plants using scent, and they find corn and tomatoes equally attractive. When both crops are growing in the same garden area, you are not just doubling your exposure to this pest. You are creating an ideal breeding ground. The moths lay eggs on corn silk, the larvae feed on the ears, and then the same population expands into adjacent tomato plants, burrowing directly into developing fruit and making it completely unusable. What makes this worse is that the physical structure of mature corn plants complicates your pest management. Tall, dense corn stands make it difficult to spot fruitworm damage until it is widespread, and they obstruct the kind of thorough garden inspection that would allow you to catch an early infestation before it spreads. There is also a shading problem with corn that mirrors what we will discuss with sunflowers later. Mature corn can reach 6 to 12 feet tall, depending on the variety. Tomatoes need direct, unobstructed sunlight for a minimum of 6 to 8 hours daily. When tall corn is planted on the south side of a tomato bed in the northern hemisphere, it can shade the tomatoes for the majority of the day during the peak growing hours, cutting photosynthesis and reducing fruit set significantly. Keep corn well away from your tomatoes. If your garden is large enough to accommodate both, plant them on opposite ends with unrelated crops in between, and be vigilant about scouting for fruitworm damage as both crops begin to mature. Handpicking larvae in the early morning is effective when populations are low, but prevention through spacing is always preferable. The fourth category covers the Brassica family, and this is a broad group that includes some of the most popular vegetables in the home garden. Broccoli, cauliflower, Brussels sprouts, cabbage, kale, kohlrabi, and collard greens all fall into this family, and all of them make poor companions for tomatoes. The primary issue is nutrient competition, but it is more complex than just two hungry plants fighting over the same soil. Brassicas have particularly aggressive root systems that are highly efficient at extracting nitrogen from the surrounding soil. Tomatoes are heavily nitrogen dependent, especially during the vegetative growth phase when they are building the canopy and root system that will support their fruit load. When brassicas are nearby, they can strip available nitrogen from the root zone faster than your fertilization can replenish it, leaving your tomatoes in a state of slow starvation even when you are adding amendments regularly. The visible symptoms of this nitrogen competition look like general poor performance. Pale yellow-green leaves, starting with the lower foliage. Slow growth. Reduced flowering. Thin stems. Gardeners often respond by adding more nitrogen fertilizer, which temporarily helps but does not solve the underlying competition problem because the brassicas simply take advantage of the increased fertility. Beyond nutrients, there is an airflow issue. Brassicas, particularly mature cabbage and Brussels sprouts, develop large, dense leaf canopies that restrict air movement at ground level when grown in close proximity to tomatoes. Tomatoes are highly susceptible to fungal diseases, including early blight, septoria leaf spot, and powdery mildew, all of which thrive in still, humid air. When brassica foliage creates a wall that traps moisture around the base of your tomato plants, you are essentially engineering the perfect conditions for these diseases to establish and spread. There is also evidence from multiple university extension studies that brassica root exudates can mildly interfere with the mycorrhizal networks that tomatoes depend on for efficient water and nutrient uptake. While this effect is less dramatic than fennel's allelopathy, it adds another layer of disadvantage to the pairing. Plant your brassicas in a dedicated bed or section of the garden with appropriate spacing between plants for airflow, and keep them well separated from tomatoes. In small gardens, time your planting so that brassicas are harvested before tomato transplants go in, since cool season brassicas and warm season tomatoes have different optimal growing windows in many climates. Now we come to one of the most dramatic and least discussed companion planting problems in the gardening world: black walnut trees. If you have a black walnut on or near your property, or if you have ever gardened under or near one, you may already know what a difficult growing environment it creates. But many gardeners are unaware of just how far-reaching the effect is and why tomatoes are among the most sensitive plants to it. Black walnut trees produce a compound called juglone, which is a chemical that the tree releases as a natural competitive mechanism. It occurs in the roots, the leaves, the nuts, the hulls, and the bark. It leaches into the soil through root exudation and through decomposition of fallen leaf and nut material. Once juglone enters the soil, it can persist for years, even after the tree has been removed. Tomatoes are among the juglone-sensitive plants, alongside peppers, apples, blueberries, and several other commonly grown food crops. When tomato roots encounter juglone-saturated soil, the compound interferes with cellular respiration, essentially disrupting the plant's ability to use oxygen at the root level. The plant's energy production collapses. The visible result is wilting that appears despite adequate soil moisture, yellowing, stunted growth, and eventual death of the plant, often within 1 to 2 weeks of transplanting into affected soil. The active juglone zone around a mature black walnut typically extends from the trunk to the outer drip line of the canopy and sometimes well beyond, depending on root spread and soil type. In sandy soils, juglone can travel further. In clay soils, it tends to be more concentrated close to the tree. A large mature black walnut can create a toxic zone of 50 to 80 feet or more in radius. If you are gardening near a black walnut, your options are to create physical barriers between the tree's root zone and your growing area, which means raised beds with weed barrier cloth and completely separate imported soil. Fabric grow bags placed on impermeable surfaces can also work. But the key understanding is that you cannot simply amend your native soil to neutralize juglone. The compound is produced continuously by the living tree and will recontaminate the soil season after season. Containerized or raised bed growing with vigilant barrier management is the only reliable solution where walnut trees are present. Let us talk about dill now, because the dill situation with tomatoes is nuanced and most advice online handles it in a way that is too simplified to be useful. You'll often hear that dill and tomatoes are incompatible, full stop. But the reality is more interesting and more useful than that. Young dill, specifically dill that has not yet begun to flower and set seed, is actually a beneficial companion for tomatoes. The umbrella-shaped flower clusters that young dill produces, even in the early budding stage, are exceptional attractors of beneficial insects. Parasitic wasps in the family Brassicas are particularly drawn to dill, and these tiny wasps are among the most effective natural predators of tomato hornworm, cabbage looper, and aphids. Having young dill near your tomatoes can meaningfully reduce pest pressure during the early season. The problem begins when dill matures and begins producing its full seed crop. At this stage, the chemistry of the plant shifts. Mature dill produces compounds, including a range of monoterpenes and phenolic acids that have demonstrated allelopathic activity against tomato root development in controlled trials. The effect is not as severe as fennels, but it is real and measurable, and in a garden context, it can translate to noticeably reduced fruit set and slowed late-season growth precisely when you want your plants pushing hard toward final harvest. The practical solution is to use dill strategically and manage its life cycle. Plant dill near your tomatoes early in the season to attract beneficial insects during the critical pollination and early fruiting period. Then harvest the dill heavily before it goes to full flower and seed, either by cutting it back repeatedly or by removing the plants entirely once they begin to bolt. You can succession plant new dill from seed every 3 to 4 weeks to maintain a continuous supply of young plants without ever letting any of them reach the problematic mature stage. This approach gives you the pest management benefits of dill while completely avoiding the allelopathic downside. Next on the list is one that surprises people because sunflowers have such a positive reputation in the garden. They are beautiful, they attract pollinators, they are easy to grow, and they have that cheerful presence that makes any garden more inviting. And most of this reputation is deserved. The problem is not with sunflowers in general. It is specifically with sunflowers planted in proximity to tomatoes, and there are two separate mechanisms causing the problem. The first is shading. Sunflowers are fast growers, and many popular varieties reach 6 feet, 8 feet, or in some cases over 12 feet in height by midsummer. Their large, broad leaves intercept and absorb a significant amount of direct sunlight. Tomatoes, as already noted, need full sun for a minimum of 6 to 8 hours daily. When sunflowers are positioned to the south or west of tomato plants in the northern hemisphere, their shadow falls directly onto the tomatoes during the brightest midday and afternoon hours. Consistently shaded tomatoes produce significantly less fruit, develop weaker immune responses to disease, and often stretch toward available light in ways that make them structurally weak and prone to breaking. The second mechanism is less well known. Like many plants in the Asteraceae family, sunflowers produce allelopathic compounds, including a sesquiterpene lactone called heliannuol that has demonstrated inhibitory effects on the germination and early growth of neighboring plants. Research has confirmed that sunflower root exudates and decomposing leaf material can suppress tomato seedling establishment. The effect is strongest in the immediate root zone but can extend outward in the soil depending on moisture levels. If you want sunflowers in your vegetable garden, plant them thoughtfully. Position them on the north side of your growing area so that their shadow falls away from your crops rather than over them. Give them at least 4 to 6 feet of separation from tomatoes and be aware of where the shade falls at different times of day before you commit to a planting arrangement. The final plant grouping on this list is the one that creates the most confusion because the logic seems to work the opposite direction from what the reality shows. Planting eggplant and peppers alongside tomatoes feels like sound gardening because these 3 crops all love heat. They all need similar fertility levels, and they can be transplanted at the same time in spring. In a small garden, grouping them together seems efficient, but this is actually one of the most common and impactful companion mistakes that tomato growers make. All three plants belong to the Solanaceae family, and that shared identity is exactly what makes grouping them dangerous. Every major tomato pest attacks peppers and eggplant with equal enthusiasm. Hornworms move freely between all three. Aphids and spider mites spread across them without hesitation. You are not creating diversity by planting them together. You are concentrating vulnerability into one corner of your garden. The disease risk compounds that problem. Bacterial spot, fusarium wilt, verticillium wilt, and several mosaic viruses infect all three crops. One sick plant becomes a source that contaminates the others, and the soil-borne pathogens left behind will be waiting for you the following season if those crops return to the same bed. Nutrient competition makes it a three-way loss. All three are heavy feeders drawing from the same pool, and the result is that none of them reach their potential. The fix is to spread them out. Different beds, different sections, enough distance that pest and disease pressure cannot jump between them. Rotate them away from any bed where nightshades grew the previous year, and follow them with legumes or alliums to help the soil recover. Before we wrap up, here is something worth understanding. Companion planting mistakes persist because gardening knowledge loses its nuance every time it gets passed along. Someone reads a simplified list, shares it, and the important details disappear in the retelling. Your neighbor swearing that fennel never hurt their tomatoes does not mean the risk is not real. It may mean their conditions partially masked it. Research on allelopathy, disease ecology, and insect behavior is a far more reliable guide than any single gardener's experience across 1 or 2 seasons. Your tomatoes need full sun, consistent moisture, good airflow, and neighbors that will not undermine any of that. Get those conditions right, and the difference in your harvest will be obvious. Before this season's planting is over, look at everything within 3 to 5 feet of where your tomatoes are going. Potatoes, fennel, corn, brassicas, walnut trees, mature dill, poorly positioned sunflowers, eggplant, peppers crowded in too close. You now have the knowledge to fix every one of those mistakes before they cost you. If you want to know what to plant with your tomatoes to actively improve growth, flavor, and pest resistance, that video is on this channel, and the link is right in the comment. If this video saved your tomato harvest, share it with one gardener who needs to hear it. And if you want to know exactly what to plant next to your tomatoes to make them stronger, more productive, and nearly pest resistant, that video is on this channel right now. The link is above me. Subscribe and hit the notification bell so you are the first to know when the next one drops. There is a lot more coming, and you do not want to be the last one in your neighborhood to know it. See you in the next one.